I am very honored to be here. I used to come more often to the Politecnico because I did seminars here and I knew many students. But in recent years, I can't walk anymore, so it's very difficult to travel. So I'm especially happy that I came to Milano for Foscarini exhibition, and I'm here. Tonight, what I thought I would talk about, because there's a great deal of return interest. I mean, it seems like almost every architect now wants to be an artist, and every artist wants to be an architect, and there's this big merging of disciplines. And, I think almost every young artist that I know is doing something with interventions or environment or landscape or something. And that started very much in the early 70s. It was very much part of the culture of New York, but it was also very connected to l'architettura radicale in Italy, but it's also, especially artists and architects in Milano and Firenze. It was very, very much of a dialogue going between these two cultural centers, and Green Street actually in New York and Italy. So, and that spread, of course, in France and Austria and other places. But it was a very important dialogue because so much came out of it that you still see today. I think many people forget exactly the power of that influence. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is really kind of the information age in which we find ourselves, but also the fact that really I think we all felt at that time, in the early days of SITE and early days of environmental art, that you could use the public domain. You could use architecture to make social and political statements. And that seems to be a little bit forgotten. I mean, again, with the advanced technology, everybody's sort of obsessed with what you can do with technology in terms of form making, shape making, space making. But it's sort of neglecting, in many ways, all of those other levels of content that are I think are really part of architecture. So let me see if I get this thing up here and started, and I will show some pictures too. Okay. First of all, I want to thank Carlo and Foscarini for sponsoring tonight's discussion. It's very kind of them to do this. But I really did, as I say, I have a sort of a sentimental part of my heart for the Politecnico, because in the old days I used to be here quite often, especially in the 80s. So again, this return, it means a lot to me. Well, if you talk about the age we live in, it's very funny because we talk about there's sort of a division between what architecture can do and what the computer can do. And, it's like this picture, sort of divided picture. Everybody's on the iPad, and yet there's also the public domain. I mean, there's people still in the streets, and they still communicate. And the sense that one gets of living in this world is that everyone's, even in the streets, they're all on the cell phone, so or on the iPad, so you can't really tell where one form of communication begins, the other ends. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and the kind of overwhelming influence that we've been subjected to with, especially all the internet and all of the social networks. I mean, it's just an endless thing. I don't know what your daily reception of information is, but this is what mine looks like every day, And it's usually the kind of things you really don't want to see, It's pornography or people taking off their clothes that you would rather see with their clothes on. And so you get this kind of, multi-dimensional collage of information that really isn't very important or isn't very pleasant. And then you get this kind of thing, which is really unpleasant. It's you're very fortunate in Italy because, we have this problem in Washington, as you know. But I know that in Italy, all of your politicians are honest and work only for the good of the people. So I'm really glad to be here. Anyway, well, it is a huge problem. It's not so funny anymore. For a while it was very humorous, but it's getting to be a tragedy and a great problem, and we hope it will end very soon. Many of my friends were asking me, how do you react, especially my foreign friends, because I've worked with a lot of foreign students in all over the world, really, Japan and Iran and China and everywhere. And they're all asking me, well, how are you reacting to Donald Trump? And so I made this one self-portrait, which sort of says it all in one shot. But the one thing that strikes me about the whole information age is the fact that, very much as Baudrillard observed, everything is simulated, where we see people as simulations. None of these movie actors are really real. At least we don't know them. We have no idea what they're like, but we're persuaded by media and all levels of media that these people are and somehow real, and that all of these guys are the sexiest man in the world, which seems sort of impossible how they could all be, but anyway. But the level of communication there's many, many levels. I mean, for the human body, for example, this is the Suicide Girls, where you think of, the elements that can communicate, there are multiple. In fact, some people use their bodies almost like signage. So that's another dimension of this communication revolution. And then, one of the most poignant and the most persistent of the human body is the T-shirt with the label. You can have your entire agenda on your chest. Whatever you believe or whatever you want to say, you can just wear it around. So this is sort of what I'm going to talk about tonight in terms of public communication, is the relationship really between the many, many levels of communication, so that we don't think that that Instagram and the cell phone are the only means by which we can get together. One that it's still very impressive. It goes on all across the world. For people who maybe in their economic level can't afford a computer or a cell phone, they in fact communicate by graffiti. Graffiti is still one of the most powerful forms of public communication. But this goes way back in history. This is amazing. This is ancient Egypt, where, public communication was walls. And this little cartoon in here was actually from 1500 BC. It's a little pornographic sketch that somebody did on a wall in Egypt, 1,500 years ago, and it's quite 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So there has been always this anxiety that we all feel to communicate, but also that architecture itself would communicate. It's always sort of a tragedy when you see Egyptian sculptures that they write right over it. Even in those beautiful relief sculptures, the next generation writes right over it. Also, in India, the famous temples of India in the 1300s, they would basically give you erotic instructions. The entire facade of the building was used for a social cause. That you should be happy, that in your sex life you should be content, and that people should have pleasure. By the time you got to the Italy and the Renaissance and so forth, the church didn't allow eroticism, but they certainly allowed an awful lot of public communication. Again, if you were in the 12th century, 13th century, if you didn't like the bishop or the cardinal, you could carve the effigy into the side of the building. So you can't count. It's only in the 20th century that architecture really became pure formalism, or shape-making, form-making, space-making, functionalism, modernism, constructivism. it's sort of we're missing this other element. And here's sort of like a comparison. I mean, you go from from eroticism to religion, and it's quite an enormous range of information that's being communicated by buildings themselves. As time has progressed, we go from public art to private art. With the 20th century, of course, became the Industrial Revolution, so we're not going to experience the Renaissance anymore because, first of all, religions became more diversified, societies became more diversified, and a lot of the patronage, the royal patronage or the papal patronage began to decline, and of course then what took over was the Industrial Revolution. So it was an entirely different language. It was a more Spartan, more conservative language in many, many ways. So what we really lost, even though like the Beaux-Arts continued communication, it was a very hollow kind of communication. If you look at the iconography of Duomo in Siena or something, compared to the iconography of the Beaux-Arts, you see that the Beaux-Arts was beginning to weaken. It wasn't really saying anything. There wasn't any really big message. It became less of communication, less of sociology and religion, and it became more of decor. So, of course, there was a huge revolution in architecture against decor, but the really big change is public patronage. Up until the mid-19th century, public patrons would support the arts. By the time you got to the mid-19th century, suddenly there was no patronage, so private art began to take over, and the artist in his studio, that idea. And also this idea of art as revolution. And this becomes a very, very important change because in history, art could be revolutionary, but not socially or contextually or politically. It had to have, there was kind of a cap on how far you could go. And I always like this statement by Oscar Wilde: an idea that isn't dangerous is unworthy of being called an idea at all. And he's absolutely right. When you think of the transition from, for example, the way Peter Paul Rubens painted the Three Graces and the Demoiselles d'Avignon of Picasso, you have a radical change in conceptual of space, conceptual of form, concept of everything. And then with collage, it became just, it just turned painting. It was probably the most revolutionary thing that ever happened to painting. And then this was followed, obviously, by Marcel Duchamp, and then the next level is conceptual art, where the art is a displacement of the whole world of art. In other words, when you, for example, if you put a Henry Moore in an art gallery, you don't displace art. You just, continue it. It's a sort of an extension of what you already know. But if you put a Yerle in a gallery, that displaces everything else. So this idea of art as concept, art as idea took over, and of course Duchamp was the master. Again, insulting classical icons with the mustache on the Mona Lisa, or designing an exhibition where his work really basically prevented the space from being occupied. Duchamp's contribution to the Surrealist exhibition was stringing up the whole space. So you had the art moving off of the canvas, off of the wall, off of the pedestal, into the space, where it actually caused an absolute revolution. So these are just two quotes from Duchamp that I sort of learned them early in life, but I think they're worth living, especially in architecture, which tends to be very conservative. I taught myself to contradict myself in order to avoid conforming to my own taste. The other great one is I'm interested in ideas, not pure visual products. And that revolution extended certainly to Jackson Pollock, where the action of the artist, the actual body, involvement became as much a part of the art as the painting itself. So it was, rightfully called action painting. And then you get in again further into intervention art, like Alan Caprow filling galleries full of automobile tires. So you have to navigate the floor of the gallery. I mean, it's in a sense eliminating the classical gallery where you wander through and look at pedestal art or framed paintings. Then went into body art. Actually, Vito Acconci and I were sort of lifelong friends, and he passed away recently. So I've been involved in some real memorials to Vito Acconci. But he started as a body artist and did these marvelous pieces of exercise routines where he would hop onto a chair one more time each day. So finally he got up to 100 hoppings on a chair. And then he did a wonderful piece called Follow Piece, where he just selected a random person, and then followed them all day, which obviously made them very nervous. But it was, again, taking art out of that contextual, old-fashioned context. And then Kusama, of course, did her protest pieces in the, the 60s and 70s, where she would have these naked dancers do protest works on bridges and at monuments in New York. And then, of course, this led to the punk revolution, where the band no longer needed to express music as much as social change and social reaction, and a level of violence. And then more recently, artists like Matthew Barney did really one of the finest works in the Guggenheim Museum, which was to occupy the entire museum as a performance. So these are very, very important steps. And then when you look at architecture, it really took quite a different direction. It obviously had more social responsibility, had more physical responsibility. And it took the form, especially in early Corbusier and some of the early Industrial Revolution, where it sort of lost, the social change was in the celebration of the Industrial Revolution, the industrial process, the new work environment, which would be completely free of distraction, and also the advent of mass transportation, speed, and then, of course, with the constructivist movement, this was more political. I mean, actually, the Russian constructivists intended this to be, significant in the Russian Revolution, socialist revolution, but this action factory was not built. But it went on. It's very, very different. You can see, like, just going back to Siena and Orvieto and the use of the architecture as a public message. It was another kind of message, much more involved with the context of industry, the context of construction materials. And then, of course, the rest has become every city in the world we know today comes from the same paradigm. So basically every city now looks almost exactly the same. And for your generation, this is probably a big problem. This needs a solution, because this isn't the only way to look at a city. There's this competition for phallic towers, really, who can build the tallest tower, and it's a Donald Trump kind of stupidity, really. That type of game is really being very, very destructive to public. Actually, what we're talking about today, which is public communication. When you look at something like Piazza Navona versus public space in Chicago or New York, you see there's a vast difference in the level of communication. And I'm not talking about, sometimes when you show pictures like this, the view is, oh, well, James Wines only likes historical art. That's not true at all. It's just that when you see something that really works and that really communicates on so many levels, you begin to respect it, because it's much more interesting than this. These are relatively new public spaces in New York. And look at the La Défense. Very few people would leave the center of Paris to go out to La Défense for pure pleasure, because you're basically, as a human being, you're like an ant running around on a paved surface. Well, anyway, the revolution that you're all familiar with, of course, began in the early postmodernist days with Robert Venturi writing Complexity and Contradiction, and then his wife, Denise Scott Brown, working on Learning from Las Vegas. And this was a counter movement to this whole idea that architecture should be bland and industrialized and modern and so forth. And what came of that is an interest in a kind of new banality, a new look at the disdained world. And of course, they looked at Las Vegas, they looked at the lighting systems, they looked at what architects from Harvard at that time would consider ugly and beneath contempt. They saw as really richly rewarding. And if you look at this new public, Millennium Park in Chicago, and you look at all the pictures around it, you'd have to admit that the pictures around it are a lot more interesting. And the relationships between people and buildings was a lot more interesting than Chicago. Well, anyway, this came, to the postmodern revolution, and a lot of work's being done, using commercial architecture. A lot of it became highly decorative. I never, bought into this very much. I was never that enthusiastic. But what kind of sad about it, at least in the hands of people like Michael Graves or Charles Moore, there was a kind of wit and restraint. But because by the time he gets to Las Vegas, it's blown to this amazing scale, and it has a lot of humor. But it is. What is interesting about it, there's a kind of deep authenticity. A friend of mine said that, like Williamsburg, which is a historic city in the United States, is really fake historicism, whereas Las Vegas is real fake. It's authentic fake. And it does bring up, Baudrillard made a very profound observation about communications and systems and media. And people have replaced all reality and meaning with symbols and signs. Thus, our experiences are a simulation of reality. We live in a world where there's more and more information and less meaning. And so you have inherited. You're at the center of that change. And there's a lot of things I think that could still be done. My generation was entering it. We were obviously well into the computer age in the 70s. But we're more interested in looking at the connections between art and architecture. All of my colleagues, Robert Smithson, Gordon Matta-Clark, all of the artists of that period were rejecting the art gallery. Everyone wanted to get out of an art gallery. And in fact, Robert Smithson said, art galleries and museums are graveyards above ground, congealed memories of the past that act as a pretext for reality. So nobody wanted to hang paintings or do pedestal art anymore. And what really came out of it was architecture as a subject matter, where we all had a lot of dialogue, and where you were starting to treat buildings or architectural experiences as art in itself. Not architecture as design, but architecture as art. And it came very much to something we all believed in at that time. This is a wonderful statement by Picasso on economy of means. Forcing yourself to use restricted means is a sort of restraint that liberates invention. It obliges you to make the kind of progress you can't even imagine in advance. And that is so true. And I think of some of my colleagues and the really good artists of that time. There was the first Biennale. I think in 1934, the German Pavilion was opened by Adolf Hitler, and so in 1993, the German Pavilion was done by Hans Haacke as a condemnation, really, of that whole Germanic tradition, from Nazism and fascism and so forth. And he did a brilliant installation. This is one of the most powerful, where he broke up the entire floor of the German Pavilion. There was nothing on the walls, and what you heard was the people walking, crunching, cracking, cracking, crunching, and as a kind of powerful social statement. One would have to admit this is more interesting than most architecture. It really is. And during the 60s and 70s and 80s, there was a lot of protest art. This is Agnes Dennis, who was an artist who, in protest to the kind of configuration of everything going up in New York, we tried to do everything horizontal. There was a whole horizontal period where here's Agnes Dennis with her wheat field in the Wall Street area, which is, when you see the original Trade Center towers in the wheat field, there's a real powerful social message going on. Gordon Matta Clark's idea was that he actually studied architecture at Columbia and cutting up buildings. Rather than building buildings or designing buildings, you take kind of a a building that's been refused by society. It's about to be eliminated. It's going to be torn down. And you reoperate on it, and it becomes art. He would split buildings and chop them up in these extraordinary ways. So there was a transformational quality where the building, this is the Paris Biennale, his conical intersect, which is very famous because it was done right across the street from the construction of the Pompidou Center. So he said himself what he was really trying to do was do the inversion or the negative of something like Pompidou Center, which is obviously very influenced by constructivism and modernism, and it's in a sense a very traditional building, even though at that time it was considered radical. But his chopping up buildings and penetrating buildings was far more radical. And in Italy too, Gianni Pettino, he came to the States and did some wonderful works. I went to the Midwest, and he and the students caked over an entire house in the Midwest, in Salt Lake City, with mud, and the residents of the house were on vacation, so they became very upset. But he was, in a sense, restoring that idea of ecological buildings being built out of mud. And, it was really a commentary. They did another piece in, I think it was Minneapolis, where there was an abandoned school building, and he and the students, started running water on it during the Christmas holidays, and so it became the ICE building. And then in California, Michael Rotundi he was remodeling a house in an industrial area. It was an old kind of sort of Beaux-Arts type of house, but it was right in the middle of an industrial area. So he just brought the industry to the building and the building to the industry. And this is an extraordinary piece by Vito Acconci, where he did an exhibition in the Mach Museum in Vienna, and took the conventional room and completely tilted and inverted the entire room. So when you came into the room, it radically changed your whole notion of that space. The space became something completely different. Conchi also did this celebration of water, and when you usually cross a bridge, you just cross the bridge. But he thought the idea that you should cross the bridge and participate in the water experience itself. So you're getting into water and the bridge and architecture simultaneous events. And then even today, this is a piece by André Jacques, where it's a water filtration system, but what he did is he took the aesthetic of water filtration and made public art of the filtration process. So in a sense, it's taking the Industrial Revolution and turning it inside out, where it actually becomes a living art kind of experience. And then a marvelous British artist who does these incredible inversions is Rachel Whiteread, which she takes a building and casts the interior space. So she takes a room like this and casts everything, and then when you're seeing the negative as the positive. And she also did a Holocaust memorial that way, which was a negative casting of the gas chambers. So you can see the social and political meaning of art. And then there's public space, which is our biggest opportunity as architects, is the public domain. And again, somebody looking at something like the Trevi Fountain versus all the kind of modernist design spaces around it, one would have to admit there's more communication going on with, the Poli Palace and the fountain itself, because it's communicating on so many levels, not the least of which is using sunlight effectively. So this is a time for rethinking, and I always say the best time for rethinking was when everything looks alike. Where I was talking to people the other night at this opening, and we were talking about a magazine like Architectural Record. I mean, you have more interesting magazines in Europe, and especially Italy, and you have more diversity of what's published. But most American architectural magazines are sort of academic, official magazines that are really more about selling steel or wall cladding or fenestration or something. And but a magazine like Architectural Record, every month they have lots of nice little things in it. Everything is very nice and very neat and very proper. But they don't really celebrate ideas. You don't see anything that I almost never see anything that really surprises me. So there is this kind of tradition of plopping things down. I mean, when you think of, again, Italy, the fusion of information on the building, and now you have something like the Henry Moore and the pool. It's like this plop art idea, and it's everywhere. I mean, this is, of course, the World Trade Center had this, terrifying catastrophe. But when it was first built, it was ironic because 2 years before 9/11, there was a big article in New York Magazine that the World Trade Center and the Plaza area are the most hated places in New York. So the terrorists actually attacked something that Americans already hated in the first place, which is an ironic twist on a great tragedy. Well, anyway, what I teach, I have a way of teaching that I try to get my students to get out of the rut, get out of their habits and their behavior patterns. And this is one of my devices for doing it, especially when we're going to design a public space. Excuse me. And I show this picture, and I say, well, in this picture is every boring cliche that appears in public space. Sculptures or potted plants or little fountains, So I tell them at the beginning of the semester that if I see anything on your computer or your desktop or your drawing board, anything that looks like this, you're going to fail my course. And of course, they just fear runs to their faces, the blood drains. And so it really has been very effective because it forces them to invent something else, to invent another kind of solution, another kind of strategy, another way of looking at the world. Well, this is kind of what we did in the beginning of SITE, where we were looking at architecture from a different perspective. Architecture as a subject matter. And we did a number of projects, public space projects, architecture projects. But, for example, in those days, there was still the car culture in America. Car culture in the 60s and 70s was huge in America. And so you could do something with car culture. And then instead of making a Henry Moore in the Plaza, or, what I call these turds in the Plaza, kind of public art, we did a public art piece which was, asphalting over the entire parking lot. So what happens is unlike the sculptures at the top, those could all be in the garden or in the museum. They could be anywhere. But if you took the ghost parking lot away, you couldn't possibly move the art to a museum. So it is totally public because you can't put it anyplace else. And even the process is public. The covering the automobiles with asphalt and the way they looked and then the way they were used became very much intrinsic to being totally public. And so this is sort of the way we work. The funny thing is, once we started, in the early days, we did a number of projects with automobiles for some strange reason. So we got a commission in Japan to do a public space next to the railway station in Yokohama. It's on the other side of the station, actually. But it was sponsored by the Isuzu car company. So they gave us this we had a meeting with all the executives of Isuzu, and they were saying, well, we want it to be like a Japanese garden. So I said, okay, it's Japanese. And they said, well, we want it to be like outer space. And they said, then naturally we want you to celebrate the Isuzu car. So if somebody gave you an assignment, it has to be like a Japanese garden, it has to be like outer space, and it has to celebrate car culture. What would you do? Well, what we did is it's very difficult for Japan because, in Japan people tend to bow and don't touch each other. So we decided we'd do a project in Japan where the people, real people, we cast families actually from life, and we did this as upside down plaza. So there you can see we're casting these people with their bicycles and their cars, and we did a completely inverted plaza where, the entire plaza was the ground level was at the feet, and it had an invisible. So it was sort of like outer space because the people were turning in space. And it was inverted, so it was nice because the Isuzu cars were upside down. They showed the car very effectively. And, of course, children and people loved it. They interacted with it. And we showed the Isuzu car. So we satisfied everyone in a funny way, but in a very perverse way. Because what we're doing is we're saying, okay, you can make something out of paving, just ordinary paving that isn't just potted trees or abstract sculptures. Well, then we did a series of buildings which became actually quite famous because they were sort of an inversion of architecture. And all my colleagues, of that generation, of course, have gone on to do very large museums and neo-constructivism became a very, very powerful movement because, the original constructivists, because of Stalinism, didn't have the chance to do much building. So a lot of the ideas from that era were blossomed beautifully. And so a lot of the major architectural work has been done with not only the advancements of the computer, but also the fact that you could make a big sculpture out of a building. A building is not, as a medieval building, many sculptures applied or much information. It's one big piece of information. But it's funny because a lot of architects who say they're doing art don't really understand the art process. For example, to me, the art process is rethinking things, rethinking or reconceptualizing. Take the teacup, and if you give it to an artist like Merit Oppenheim, you can see the transformation, the genius of her transformation. She's taking something you don't think about, a common thing, and transforming it into another dimension of meaning. And my contention is, and I'm just being sort of sarcastic or facetious, is that if you gave the fur-lined teacup, if it wasn't a famous artwork, and you gave it to, 5 formalist architects, what they would do is they would shave it, and then they would, redesign it in sort of the manner of Corbusier or something like that. So there really is a difference in this kind of design attitude and art attitude. From my perspective, I've always liked archetypes, things that you're so commonplace that you never think about them, like the bank building and the typical skyscraper and the suburban house or the fast food restaurants. They all look the same. They're all the same subconscious language. And so when SITE first started, we had an art patron. He was actually a big art collector, but he owned these shopping centers, these big box stores. So everybody knows what they look like. You know what they look like. You know what they sell. You drive by. You never think about it. The signage is always the same. And I had always been fascinated, again, from my love of Italy, fascinated with what you could do with information on the facade. And even in early America, that information level became very important. So one of our first buildings was taking one of those typical best buildings, and at that time, actually the same week that we opened this building in Texas, that building by Caesar Pelli opened too, and that was considered the cutting edge of shopping center architecture, and it was high design. And so again, we were doing sort of the opposite. This is sort of, again, the inversion of it. And my fascination with doing something in the junk world was the fact that you're bringing art where you least expect to find it in this kind of public domain. So we went on to do a whole series. We did a building, and I'd always been disturbed by the fact that people move, but buildings stand still. So this was a building that was mobilized by the people who did the lunar rover. They designed the motor system for this. But the building is closed like a jigsaw puzzle, and then when you open it, it separates, becomes a public space, but it also becomes a piece of sculpture. So it's one thing when it's closed and a completely different circumstance when it's open. And we did a whole series that was dealing with light and shadow. This is in Florida, where you're dealing with spatial dimensions, where you can address the building at any scale that you feel comfortable with. It's funny, during that period, we were getting in quite a bit of notoriety, and American architects really hated what we were doing. We were more successful in terms of the media in Europe, but there was a lot of American press. They were always comparing our buildings to, failure of social change or a failure of the stock market or something. So it became interesting. I found it very fascinating that you could design a building that then would be used for all of these other social meanings, all of these other communicative meanings. We went on, as I say, dealing with equilibrium, again, dealing with what you would see from the highway. In other words, these are highway buildings, so we thought the highway experience should be part of the architecture. Very much like the old West, in the spaghetti westerns, all those Clint Eastwood movies. They always have those kind of old towns with the false fronts. And so it's sort of, again, that part. This is a very nice quote that was said rather recently by an author in France about Sight's work. It's an architectural invention James Wines of Sight created that fascinates me. It consists in designing architecture as it is expected to be, yet this paradigm is frozen, corrupted, and dramatized in a way which cannot be ignored and therefore questions this paradigm. This technique is a perfect architectural adaptation of what the situationists were calling détriment, a form of acknowledgement that resistance toward the establishment can only be accomplished by the same establishment's weapons and pictorial objects, and therefore the hijacking of those weapons in order to flip them back towards their system of production. And that was a very, very astute observation, because that's exactly what we're doing. We're really taking the establishment values, commercial architecture, big box stores, American merchandising, Wall Street, all these things, and using art as a kind of critical commentary of that same kind of building. And this was a very interesting for me, because this one went inside to outside. You would cut through, and so the thermal barrier, where it cut the objects in two, on the outside it all became ghosted, and on the inside they became real. So you were seeing the same. It was changing the whole relationship. You see the conventional relationship of merchandise in a normal shopping center. This was changing the relationships of the actual things you buy completely. And children, of course, love this building. And again, it was sort of the opposite of Centre Pompidou. It's just they're making it the inside outside, but they're doing it in a very formal way. This is doing it in another kind of inverse way. We also did projects, theoretical projects. We were very disturbed by the bleakness of American development communities, high rise. What could high rise be? All the suburbia in America and all the cities are becoming this, where you have no identity. There's no identity left, and so we did a whole project with Pratt Institute and Cooper Union in New York on the high rise of home, which was really the architectural equivalent of what Marcel Duchamp referred to as can chance. In other words, you're building a matrix, but the architect cannot control the iconography. He can't control the collage. So that was a really interesting idea, and it also related to Corbusier had sort of an idea like that for the for the viaduct housing in Algiers, but he was going to design everything, and that's different. We like the idea of the collage, where it's like the 19th century collage houses, where you could order up any kind of door or, any system you wanted to and just plug it in. And so we did many versions of it. We did it to be adapted to if you're going to tear down a building, you could adapt it to this idea. You could put it in the cityscape. But again, this idea of canned chance, where the architect no longer controls the image of the building, but the inhabitant's identity becomes the primary force for change. This building has had, even though it's never built, of course, it's had a lot of influence, but always slightly misunderstood from my perspective. It never had the chance feeling. There are lots of, collage buildings like this that people are always sending me pictures like this on the emails. Oh, James, I found a building that's just like your high-rise at home. Well, not really, not completely. Anyway, context is a big thing too, and we're in the age of not only information, we're also in the age of ecology. And so I wrote a book in about 2000, which is really looking at the aesthetic side of green, because, you can have a green building, but it can be so ugly that it has no sustainability because people want to get rid of it very fast. There's an awful lot of, LEED-approved buildings, green buildings that are really ugly buildings. So we started thinking about, preservation. One of the projects actually we built for Best Products, there was an existing forest. So we basically built the building around the forest. So we preserved the trees and kept this environment. This is a shopping center, and it's really unique. I mean, nobody's ever done one like this. So it was an inside-outside relationship. It also was above ground, below ground. Landscape architecture always is always on the surface. And because this is on a hillside, we took advantage. So behind the facade, the glass wall, we put the actual layers of the topography. We put the topography. But you can sort of see the attitude is sort of nature's revenge, which again is an inversion of your expectations. And we did another one in Florida where we preserved all of the foliage and we made a rainforest out of it. So the whole building is about water. And it's nice because when you see it on the highway, it's all wiggling all the time. It's always moving. It's because of the water and the sunlight and everything on the surface. And there's the garden as well. We went on to do public spaces. In Chattanooga, we were hired to build a public space around this aquarium building. And this is the way it looked when we started. This is the way the waterfront looked. And it had been destroyed by kind of railroad. It was a railroad center where they parked the railway cars. So it was very polluted and it had to be cleaned up. And we were just, supposed to make a park there. So we made a park and a plaza, but it's very mountainous in that area. So we thought we would use the terrain, the actual topography of Chattanooga, to create this park. So you would have shade and light and hills and valleys. And this was with the background, it's an amphitheater. The foreground is the entranceway. But then on the ground, we the grid of the city, and then we just broke up the paving where there's a water. There's an old canal there, and we broke up the paving, let the canal go through the whole plaza, so that what you're really doing then rolling up the plaza. You're rolling up the plaza, cracking up the paving. So you're doing many arbitrary things just with concrete, just with the dullest of materials. And it did. It really opened up a park experience. We did a water wall, to cover the offices of the aquarium so people would see children through the water, And then we went down to the river. We laid stones that were in the shape of the river. And then, so you would always be kind of experiencing the river or the mountains or it was never just the paving. It was always the paving and something else going on. And actually, this project had a lot of influence on New York. I mean, you can see all the rolling up things and cracking and splitting and everything were all done in the High Line. It's done that way, and there's other parks in New York that are being done. This idea you cut into the paving or you roll it up or you invert it or do something. More recently, we worked on a project in India, which was, again, unfortunately not realized, but it's interesting because it was really about it gave us an opportunity to work on a cultural situation. It was supposed to be the home of the Albani family, and they bought this property on the highest part of Mumbai, and our suggestion was, why don't they make a vertical park, like a central park that's vertical? And so we started studying the whole principles of Vastu architecture in India and the layering, and how when you're designing architecture in India, it's really like the human body. You're starting with the earth, and then as you move upward, you're going towards the brain, which of course is toward enlightenment. So I said, when I started sketching the ideas for it, I thought of trying to break the building up into the body, and then figuring out how to do it. By the way, I still draw by hand. I don't know if anybody here still does hand drawing, but I find it a very quick way to get ideas out of your head. I mean, if I have to do it on a computer, I have to wait for the program to come up, and I find it's much faster to do it this way. But I got this idea that it would be very kind of interesting to suspend the whole building, because, when you build, in fact, my engineer was very happy with this idea because when you build tall buildings, it's very expensive to have all those cranes and everything. The idea here was to build the core, put a truss at the top, and then drop cables, and then build all the floors on the ground, and then hoist them up into position. So you're building the floor plane basically on the ground, and then each one would be part of that sort of Vastu principle, and they would celebrate earth, water, fire, air, sound, light, and so you can sort of see the idea of how we developed the areas. It was also a very green building. We did a lot of studies of wind and technology, and what you do in the monsoon season, and we did all kinds of experiments with reflected light, because it's very warm there, it's very hot, so the idea of deflecting heat and light. So we did a lot of work on this project. These are two sketches of the solution, but the idea of this suspended building in space. And this is just kind of finishing off here. This is a little project in Italy, which, I'll show it how it's supposed to be. It opened a few years ago. It's a sculpture park in Briosco. And the idea was to take the existing farm and the existing walls and just extend them, just wrap them around, and they create a whole building. Then we created a module that you could build everything out of it, since they were going to mount sculptures and platforms, and so you could build everything in the whole park out of the same module, which was these columns. And they could also, you could just have them as pure sculpture or columns or part of the building. And since the building was on this hillside, it was on this hillside at the top, with a monastery in the background, we thought we'd just come down the hillside and then continue the hillside right into the building itself. So you see that the building just... And the idea is it's supposed to gradually be completely consumed by nature. That was the whole idea, is that eventually all of this would grow up around it, and you would not see it. You would see out of the building into the park and into the farm, and then these modules would go all over the place. They would define, here where you see it defining the entryway and gardens, and the wall system was everywhere. It also went inside the building, and to make it so you could see everything very well, the stairway and it all looks out. So it all, look, this is part of the opening day period. But you can see that it's supposed to be completely fused with nature. In other words, you're supposed to see the monastery and the hillside and the building as a unified idea. And this is sort of, again, taking that idea that we used in the early Best building and extending it to the environment. Well, just to conclude here, I just wanted to also make this a celebration of my sponsor, and the reason I'm in Italy is Foscarini, which, as you certainly know, does some of the most imaginative and edgy lamps and products in the world. I mean, I always very much admire things that seem like they're so simple and so just what they are, but then you look at it a little longer, and you begin to realize it's something else at the same time. So they were our sponsors for this light bulb series, we call it. And basically, it just takes the classic bulb and inverts the meaning. In other words, everybody knows what the bulb is like. Now we have LED. Everything is LED, and nobody seems to like LEDs. They're in all kinds of shapes, but the light bulb is still the classic subconscious shape of a light. So we wanted, this is a celebration of the classic bulb. And the idea is to take the classic bulb and invert it, change the meaning. It could, the usual is the wires and the sockets are opaque, but this one, reverses it. The bulb is opaque and the wire is lighted. And so again, we wanted to invert the room where it's going to be. And so it's a whole series really that emerges from the black bulb and the white bulb, and it emerges into all these different variations. And we hope it'll be a whole series that will just go on and on and on. And so you really have melting bulbs. You have the melting bulb, and you have the plant light, and you have the black bulb, and the white bulb, and the candle light. And it extend these concepts so that you really have the classic core, which is the simple bulb, and then you just think of all different ways of other meanings that it might have. So it goes back again to our sort of classic work, which is to invert that meaning of that building, and what is that core after all. And again, all of SITE's work has had at each one of the projects, whether it's a product or has had at its core a word. It's either melted or cascaded or mobilized, diffused, consumed, displaced, floated. We did floating buildings. We did, morphed buildings that came out of the pavement. We did, of course, buried. We did buried buildings, inverted, peeled, fragmented, ghosted, exposed, dematerialized. We did invisible spaces. We did cracked and collaged. So we've really taken words that are not normally part. I mean, if you go to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, you don't see these words being used very often to describe buildings. So in a way, it's still, from my way of thinking, using words that are part of the language, and it makes it, again, it gives it a more social, political, whatever sort of meaning. And we've done when you look at all these public spaces that are still being done, these are relatively new. This isn't, I'm not showing you pictures of something done 30 years ago, but all of the mentality behind these spaces could have been done 50 years ago. And so the idea is also to animate space. It's to think of things that people, you can do with a space that activates people so they invent their own games, that they invent something themselves that comes out of whatever the activation source is. So it goes back to this thing, and really, personally, I like Duchamp. He says, I'm interested in ideas, not mere visual products. And I really like that idea. I often say that, SITE's work is about idea, attitude, and context rather than form, space, and structure. And again, these traditions of, traditions like this of formalism do go back to the 50s. I mean, most of even though that we're using computers to simulate the forms, they still go back to Henry Moore and Jean Arp and all that kind of very organic sculpture of the 1950s. So it'd be nice to, my way of thinking for your generation, the things that are the most powerful influences are not the computer as a tool that you just use as technology, but as something you stand back from and look at as a system or as an influence or and it's all about invisibility. It's interesting that the echo revolution is all about systems and the computer generation is all about systems. So they're both about invisible systems. So, if I were starting over like you are, you're starting at the beginning, I would look at all these other meanings that things have. What are the other meanings that they might have? And, we certainly know. I mean, I love the little photograph of the romance at the top right there. I mean, if you extract that kind of communication that you have in the public domain, you see it classically in Italy. I mean, still the cities of Italy are spaces that people actually use and communicate very vigorously on a daily basis. It's not only on the internet. It's not only on your cell phone. So that's what I'm really saying, that, it's rethinking everything. I say whatever you're doing, whatever you're looking at on your drawing board, there's always a great virtue in rethinking it, because the best things come out of the simplest things. It can be coming right out of the paving. Thank you.